They say that a good landing is a landing which you can safely walk away from, right? So if you don't crash, you've basically made a good landing. Now, of course, that's in some way true, but I guess you all want to make good landings, right? So here are my 7 tips that will help you to make better landings manually. Now, do note that these tips are for flight simulation only, and that it actually applies to any aircraft type you fly. You know, if I had to learn you how to land a 737, it would have been best that I sat next to you. But of course, that's not possible. So here are some general tips that will help you out on landing any aircraft type that you fly. So let's start with tip number 1. Guys, tip number 1 is all about practicing slow flight. So what does it mean? Basically what happens is you're going to fly your airplane at slow speed and kind of get a feeling of what it's like to steer the airplane at those speeds. So what you're going to do is climb to a safe altitude, get the throttle down, get those flaps down, get the gear down if you have a retractable gear, and fly the airplane at those low speeds, because those are the speeds and the configurations that you're going to be landing your airplane in when you're landing on a runway, right? Of course, when you're taking off, you're going to be flying way differently, right? You're going to have higher speeds, you're going to quickly accelerate to 160 to 200 to 250 knots, and your airplane will be behaving way differently at those speeds than when you're landing on a runway at 140 knots in the 737, for example, with flaps down and gear down and all the drag that comes with it. So make sure you practice slow flights, make some little left and right turns, some small climb and descents, so you really get a feeling of what it's like to steer the airplane at those low speeds and in landing configuration. And at an altitude you can safely do that and practice that without having to land per se. So that really helps to get a feeling of what it's like to control the airplane during the landing. Tip number 2, guys, you have to make sure that your weight and balances are correct and your speeds, right? Of course, you don't want to land your airplane right at the maximum landing weight, of course. I mean, your approach speed is going to be way higher. You're going to see the runway coming at you much faster. It's just not very helpful, especially if you're new to making landings. So what I recommend is really make sure that the weight and balance of your aircraft are correct, and if you're using an airline or with an FMC, make sure that you don't have too much fuel on board when you land, and make sure that your center of gravity is correct. And of course, you have to go into the FMC to set an approach speed, all things like that. So make sure that's correct first, because otherwise you might be landing with a too high speed or a too low speed, So really make sure that those calculations are correct. Now, if you're flying a small general aviation airplane, it's going to be a little bit of less importance, but still, you don't want to be too heavy. You want to make sure that all the baggage is in the back of your aircraft and that you're, have a higher risk of a tail strike, So keep that in mind. Tip number 3. Guys, you have to make sure that you have a stable approach. It's very important, right? You don't want to come in too high on a glide slope and, ditch your airplane all the way down and realizing that your speed is way too high as you land the airplane. You don't want that. So make sure that the approach is stable. There are several ways to do that. Make sure that air traffic controller does a good job at vectoring you. Keep an eye on your FMC if you're flying an airliner. Make sure that VNAV path is correctly set, that you're not using too high speeds on approach, things like that. So it's in general just very useful to have a stable approach before you're going to practice landings. As I said, you don't want to come in with too high speeds, with too high altitudes, so make sure your approach is already stable before you're going to make your landings. Tip number 4. Guys, it's very important to trim down your airplane when you're landing, right? You don't want to be pushing and pulling on that yoke all the time. It's just more comfortable for you as the pilot to trim down the airplane using the elevator trim on the yoke if it has one, or using the trim wheel on the general aviation airplane that you fly. Otherwise, you're going to be correcting all the time with the yoke. It's just very tiring. You want to relieve the stress of the yoke in order to fly a smooth approach. So what you're going to do is really find a trim setting at which you can descend at a proper descent rate. So a setting which basically allows you to smoothly glide down to the runway without giving too much elevator input. You really want to relieve the stress of the yoke. And even if it's windy, you can find some kind of proper trim setting, because it can be, even though you're kind of hopping your way down to the runway, that trim setting actually really helps, and you probably don't even have to use too much elevator input. Now, of course, it's a different story when there's a lot of wind, right? When there's a lot of turbulence. I mean, you probably have seen cockpit videos where they land airplanes in storms and things like that. In that case, you're really going to have to work with the yoke. But, if the winds are pretty calm, if there are no winds at all, you know, you can very well use the trim, and of course, you know, for any landing you have to use the trim in order to relieve as much pressure from the yoke as possible, because it's going to be way easier for you. Tip number 5. So when landing, you're probably going to be looking around in the cockpit a lot. You know, you're going to be looking if your flaps are down, if your speed brakes are armed. You're probably looking at the overhead panel, for example, if you're flying the 737, to make sure that the engine start switches are continuous. Now, I would really recommend that during the final stages of the landing, so at like 4D, when you're going to slow down from your 160 knots to your final approach speed, make sure that you have a fixed eye point, right? So that you don't have to look around in the virtual cockpit all the time. So what you're going to do, what I always do, is kind of find an eye point where I can see the PFD, the ND, or just all the basic instruments in front of me. I can see the runway properly, and I can also see the horizon, because the horizon is going to be very important when flaring the aircraft. So you don't want to be moving around with your eye point in the sim all the time when you're landing. You know, make sure you have a fixed view, so you can use your eyeballs to look down and look up, you know, a little bit to check your instruments, to check the runway, and you don't want to use that button on your joystick or the yoke all the time to look around in the cockpit, because it's, you know, you want to focus on the landing at that point, right? So make sure you have a fixed eye point. It really helps to make a smooth landing. Tip number 6. So when you come in for landing, you'll probably notice that you know, the ILS indicators and the PAPI lights go crazy. They turn white on red, and the glide slope indicator really jumps up and down, and that's because you are getting closer to the runway, so it's going to become more sensitive. Now, what I would really recommend during the final feet of your landing, just look outside. Don't worry too much about those glide slope and localizer indication anymore. And definitely do not worry about the PAPI lights anymore. Just look outside, look at the horizon, and focus on your flare and on your touchdown zone. Because you want to get that aircraft down on that touchdown zone and, you know, flare the aircraft. So, I mean, those indications are going to get crazy anyway. And of course, they are important for the initial phase of the approach. But, you know, when it comes to landing, just look outside. Listen to the ground proximity warning systems, altitude call-outs if you're flying an airliner, and, you know, it just makes the landing smoother because you focus on the right things. And then finally, tip number 7. Guys, it's very important to realize that a good landing is not necessarily a smooth landing. Actually, a good landing is a landing that's pretty firm and is within the touchdown zone, right? You know, especially if the runway is wet, for example. Actually, you do want to have a firm landing in order to get more grip on the runway, because if you're going to have a very smooth landing, there's going to be this layer of water between the runway and the gear, which makes it a lot harder to brake and slow down the airplane. So what you really want to focus on during landing is landing within the touchdown zone. You do not want to focus too much on making a good flare, make the landing very smooth, because especially if the runway is pretty short, you know, you're going to realize it's quite hard to get stopped before the end of the runway. So yeah, when you focus on that, you know, your landing is probably going to be better than when you make a very long and smooth flare, but you're already out of the touchdown zone. So I hope these tips have helped you out a little bit. As I said, these tips kind of apply to any aircraft that you land. I'll probably make some more videos later on to look at more specific aircraft on how to land those. But I thought these tips will help you out to generally improve your landings, okay? So thanks for watching this video here on the Aviation Pro channel. Make sure you comment, like, and subscribe, and share this video. It's of course very much appreciated, and if you have any questions, you can leave them below. Also make sure that you check out my website, aviationpro.nl, because there's a lot more information on there about VetSim, about flight simulation, and flying in general. So go over to aviationpro.nl and find out more. So thanks for watching this video, and I'll see you next time.